Deltarune is a mysterious game. Not super surprising since we've only experienced about 2/7 of it thus far, but even ignoring its unorthodox manner of release, this is a title founded on questions. Everything from the game's announcement to its anniversary events has been littered with secrets and mysteries waiting to be solved. Some of these mysteries relate to Easter eggs, some to the story, and some to the gameplay itself. And nothing in Deltarune brings those three elements together quite like the Dark Worlds. Dark Worlds are both at the center of Deltarune's narrative and the driving force of its gameplay. Each one creates a unique world to explore, providing ample opportunities for characters to adventure and develop, and simultaneously pushing us closer to the Roaring, the apocalyptic event that Deltarune seems to be teasing as its finale. And the coolest thing about Dark Worlds is that they could be just about anywhere. Through their nature, Dark Worlds take the surrounding elements of their corresponding real-world location and bring them to life in vibrant characters and creative settings. Meaning that if a place has, things in it, a Dark World could feasibly take form there, creating a whole new chapter of Deltarune goodness. Those vast possibilities are exciting from a narrative perspective, but definitely make things a little more difficult for us theorists, as predicting future Dark Worlds means sorting through a hometown full of options. It also doesn't help that beyond the first 3 chapters, we have no story context as to why these characters might end up in these locations, or why dark fountains might be created there. But when has a lack of information or proof ever stopped us Undertale fans, right? In all seriousness though, based on the knowledge we currently have, plus a few teases from Toby Fox, I think it is possible to guess which Dark Worlds will appear in which chapters. Will I be right? We'll have to wait and see, but currently, I feel semi-confident. So, with that said, let's get into the predictions. As of right now, we have 3 Dark World locations confirmed. Chapter 1's old classroom, Chapter 2's library computer lab, and Chris's own house for Chapter 3, revealed to us in Chapter 2's cliffhanger ending. Oh, and of course Castletown in the school's closet, though that isn't particularly relevant right now. And before we get into dropping our predictions, I think it's important to lay down some rules. These rules aren't necessarily end-all be-all since, again, we've got less than half a game of trends to take note of, but I do think there's some valid stuff in here that's key to nailing these Dark World locations. 1. The double door rule. Each Dark World is hidden behind a door, and to this point, all of those doors have been double doors. As of Chapter 2, Chris and Susie even have a unique Dark World entering animation that I think would be pretty tough to fit into a regular-sized door. But the thing that really gives the double door rule credibility is that in Chapter 1, the computer lab in the library was behind a single door. This was mysteriously turned into a double door in Chapter 2, when the lab became a relevant Dark World location. Why would Toby change this if a doubled Dark World wasn't necessary? To me, this near confirms that a double door is mandatory. But that last point kinda brings us to rule number 2, Toby can do whatever he wants. If Toby changed a single door to a double door in the transition from Chapter 1 to Chapter 2, what's to stop him from doing it again in the transition from Chapter 2 to Chapters 3 to 5? I hope this isn't the case, because it kind of feels like a cheap way to artificially preserve mystery, but it is something to keep in mind for sure, even if it's not the most likely thing in the world. And rule number 3, the cutscene bypass. At the end of Chapter 2, we see a cutscene in which Chris creates a dark fountain in their living room. And from teases during the Spamton Sweepstakes, Undertale's 7th anniversary event, we can learn 2 things. 1, that the Dark World is pulling from the entire house, not just the living room, note the parallels to Chris and Asriel's beds in the green room, and 2, our characters are seemingly waking up in the Dark World, which makes sense considering Susie and Toriel were fast asleep when Chris created the fountain. What this means is that should a cutscene that brings us into a Dark World occur, we can skip jumping into it, thereby bypassing the aforementioned double door rule. These are my firm Dark World detecting rules, but I'd like to throw another soft one on top of them: variety. This one isn't huge since there's no telling if an area that looks one way in Chapter 2 will look the same in, say, Chapter 6, but Dark Worlds are built from a location's varied elements, so if a place is relatively mundane with few elements to transform, it's a little harder to imagine a Dark World taking place there. Something to think about going forward. Okay, enough rule setting, let's not waste any more time and get predicting, starting with Chapter 4, The Church. Far from an original take, I know, but this one just makes sense. There are numerous elements pointing towards Hometown's church being our 4th Dark World location. Firstly, we have Rudy's dialogue from the end of Chapter 2, where he tells Noelle that he might be feeling good enough to go to church the next day. Initially, I thought this could have been a deconfirmation. If the church service is occurring the following day, and Chapter 3 takes place in Chris's house, wouldn't we miss it? Thankfully, this doesn't seem to be the case, as evidence suggests that Chapter 3 will occur in a single night. The primary hint to this comes from Deltarune's 2022 status update. In it, Toby released a handful of new music tracks, one of which was titled Hometown Day. The caption for this track was, "After the dark night, the sun shines brightly," which seems to imply that this dark world will be taken care of by sunrise. On the subject of Chapter 3, it's looking like it might end up being a pretty unorthodox chapter of Deltarune. In the most recent Undertale Deltarune newsletter, Toby had this to say about it. As you can tell, this chapter is shaping up to be a pretty strange one. I mostly focused on unusual gameplay elements, and it's not too heavy on the story. Since it's so frivolous, I feel a bit self-conscious about it, but at least I got to try something different. Anyway, Chapter 4 will be a much more standard chapter. This is a very intriguing statement to me, not because of the info it gives us on Chapter 3, but what it implies about Chapter 4, and it all leads back to the church. If Chapter 3 is predominantly goofy TV world antics, and Chapter 4 is getting us back on track narratively, what better reintroduction than examining Hometown's religion? We can explore concepts like the Angel, get returning characters like Noelle, and new characters like Father Alvin involved. By all merits, this would be the best possible way to have the story rev up again. As we get further away from what we know, things will naturally begin to be harder to predict. To myself and many others, the church feels like a done deal, but going forward with no discernible story, it's gonna start getting less concrete. Chapter 5, to me, is the biggest enigma we're facing here. I believe there are clear narrative implications as to where Dark Worlds might appear in 6 and 7, but 5 is in this weird middle ground where it's not quite endgame, but also not close enough to where we are to get a firm idea like with Chapter 4. This leaves 5 in a pretty difficult position prediction-wise. Right now, I've got two ideas as to where this fountain could be created. The first, Asgore's Flower Shop. This is another popular prediction among fans, and for good reason. There's a lot to work with here. The floral theme would give the Dark World a standout look to it. We've had kingdoms and cities so far, but an overrun plant world, or maybe even a jungle, would be something we haven't seen yet, and something that no other location in Hometown could really provide. Asgore himself is also a major character that's bound to get more to do. He's Chris's dad, that alone gives him a strong connection to the story, especially since their familial issues seem to be plot relevant. And unless Toriel books it at the sight of a fountain of darkness emerging from her living room, Chapter 3 sets the precedent of Chris's family members ending up in Dark Worlds. Plus, all these brightly colored flowers, especially that familiar looking one, are just begging to be explored. All that said, I'm not the only one who feels like this is too obvious, right? And not obvious like another location on this list that's clearly being built up to in the story, but obvious like possible red herring obvious? Like, we've got an extremely prominent double door in a location most every player has visited, surrounded by references to soul traits and Flowey, in a building with an immediately discernible theme for a Dark World. It seems too perfect. That being said, we'll keep it in mind as our safer option as we move to a less sensical but equally possible prediction, the hospital. On a surface level, this seems like a far less likely candidate. The hospital violates one of our soft rules from earlier, the variety rule. As a hospital, it's intentionally sterile, with little to provide in terms of a diverse item set. Rudy's room, the likeliest location for a Dark World, does have a double door, but it's not centered like the others, instead hanging to the side where it could be difficult for that animation to occur. But hear me out, okay, because we're about to theorize. We all agree Rudy's not making it out of this game alive, right? I mean, he's dead in Undertale, as confirmed by the 5th anniversary Winter Party dialogue, and he's not doing so hot in Deltarune either. So even if he makes it to church in Chapter 4, regardless of whether he's involved in Dark World shenanigans, I'm willing to bet he's back in the hospital by Chapter 5. If he's doing worse, different characters could drop off gifts in the hospital room, solving the variety issue. And assuming Noelle's by his side, which why wouldn't she be, she'd likely be in a very emotional state, looking for some escapism and a prime candidate for Dark World creation, spawning a wintry wonderland of grief and sorrow. Chris and Susie catching her in the act would then initiate the cutscene bypass, circumventing any issues caused by the uncentered door. That's a lot, I know, but hey, you gotta get creative with this stuff, right? The reason for my confliction, though, is that the exact same narrative setup could be used for a flower shop Dark World. Rudy ends up back in the hospital, his best friend is mysteriously not present, Chris and Susie go to his place to grab him, only to find that a dark fountain did first. These predictions are on opposite sides of the fence. One has so much going for it that it could be intentionally misleading, the other is built on assumptions with far less concrete elements. Overall, call me a coward, but I think I'm gonna have to go with Flower King. I feel like the responsible choice is the one that requires way less conjecture to make sense, but man, I'm gonna be so annoyed if it ends up being the hospital. I was this close. Thankfully, for Chapter 6, you guys won't have to listen to me deliberate over which headcanon I prefer, because this Dark World is one that I'm far more certain of, the Festival. One could argue this is a cop-out since it's not a firm place in Hometown, but I strongly believe this Dark World location simply isn't visible to us yet. The festival is an upcoming event in Deltarune that Chapter 2 started to tease. Per Susie's description, it transforms Hometown into a carnival. This seems like the perfect setting for a late-game Dark World. It's classic, the town-wide celebration interrupted by sci-fi or magical shenanigans that only our heroes can put a stop to. I can only imagine just how creative this Dark World's theme would be. Circus, carnival goofiness, but with a dark twist representative of the Roaring's growing threat. Again, since the festival isn't set up yet, a hard location is difficult. I do believe it'll be behind this police tape, but I can't really go all, here's the exact door Chris and Susie are going to go through like I did with my other predictions. That said, this guess is one that I feel very confident in. And finally, Chapter 7. Come on. Come on. I don't care how basic it is, guessing anything else is a fool's errand. The bunker door is clearly being set up as highly important. Not only does it emit the funny gasser sound effect, but as seen in Chapter 2, Chris clearly has a history with this place. Snowy and Monster Teen comment on the fact that Chris has seen something concerning behind this door. And after scaring the two off, Susie even refrains from asking Chris about it, like everyone knows it's a sensitive subject. Whatever ends up going down in Deltarune, it's hard to imagine that it doesn't lead us right here. I don't think the game will end in this bunker, there'll be a whole Roaring to explore after the fact in my opinion, but as far as conventional Dark Worlds go, this is our final stop. And there you have it, a complete list of Deltarune's Dark Worlds. Like I said earlier, there's truly an incredible amount of options here, so it's possible your list will look very different from mine. And I'd love to see that list. Which Dark Worlds do you think we'll see in Deltarune, and which directions do you think the story will go in to lead us there? Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you later.